The church bell had not yet finished its seventh ring when Daniel Hargrove took his seat in the second pew from the front, exactly as he had done every Sunday for 10 years. He came before the widow Callahan, who liked to arrive early to claim her favorite corner near the window. He came before the Hendricks children, who raced each other up the church steps most mornings. He came before the sun had fully cleared the ridge behind the schoolhouse, when the dust on the road still lay undisturbed, and the only sound was his own boots against the wooden floor. He always sat in the same place. Not the front pew, that would have seemed a claim, a presumption. The second pew on the right, with a careful space beside him that no one in 10 years had ever tried to fill. By the time the congregation had gathered, hats in hand, children hushed by their mothers, Daniel was already seated still, his eyes fixed somewhere past the altar rail as though counting the years in the grain of the wood. He said little. He nodded to the men who tipped their hats, answered questions about cattle prices and rainfall with the same unhurried courtesy he gave to everything, and slipped out after the final hymn before anyone could catch him for supper. It was, by now, simply understood, the way a hitching post is understood, or the shape of a familiar hill. Daniel Hargrove came to church and waited. No one asked why, because everyone already believed they knew. He was not, by any account, a broken man. Those who worked his land, and there was a great deal of it, more than any other ranch in 3 counties, left to him 5 years ago upon his father's death, spoke of him with plain respect. Cornelius Hargrove had been a hard man who built a fortune out of stubbornness and drought-proof cattle. His son had inherited the fortune, but softened its edges. Daniel paid fair wages before being asked. He forgave a debt for the Petersons the winter their well went dry, and never mentioned it again. He was, by every measure that mattered in that country, a decent man and a wealthy one, and the matchmaking women of the town agreed with some exasperation, an infuriatingly unmarried one. Mothers had tried. Fathers had tried harder, seeing in Daniel Hargrove the sort of match that could secure a family for 2 generations. He turned down each introduction with the same even gentleness, and after enough years, even the boldest of them stopped trying. It was not that Daniel disliked company. It was that he seemed, in some fundamental and unspoken way, already spoken for, by an absence rather than a presence, which is a harder thing to compete against than any living rival. It was into this quiet arrangement that Deacon Thomas Weller arrived, fresh from a seminary back east, eager and a little too observant for a town that preferred its histories left undisturbed. For 3 Sundays he had watched Daniel Hargrove take that same seat, leave that same space, stare at that same patch of altar rail with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to an empty church. He had asked Mrs. Petrie, the caretaker, once, carefully. She had only pressed her lips together and said, "Best not to pry, Deacon. Some things the town just carries for a person," and gone back to trimming the altar candles. But on the 4th Sunday, after the last hymn had faded and the congregation had filed out into the warm morning, Thomas found himself alone with Daniel, who lingered, as he always did, a few minutes longer than anyone else. "Mr. Hargrove," Thomas said, and then hesitated, feeling the weight of a boundary he was about to cross. "Forgive me if this is forward. I don't mean to intrude on something private." Daniel looked up, not unkindly. "But I've watched you 3 Sundays now," Thomas went on, "and I find myself wondering, who are you waiting for?" Daniel was quiet a moment. Then, strangely, something in his shoulders eased, as though the question were a small mercy rather than an offense. "No one's asked me that plainly in a long while, Deacon," he said. "Sit, if you've got a minute." And so, in the hush of the empty church, with the morning light falling long across the floorboards, Daniel told him. 10 years ago, at this very altar, he had stood ready to marry Helen Ashworth, daughter of a judge who'd brought his family west trying to outrun some disgrace no one in town ever quite named. Helen had been unlike anyone Daniel had known. Educated, quick-witted, unafraid to laugh at herself, willing to learn to ride astride instead of side-saddle just to keep pace with him across the flats at dawn. Their courtship had been simple and full, long rides, borrowed books, the particular comfort of finding someone who made ordinary days feel worth remembering. Her father had not approved, not truly, but had allowed the wedding to proceed, until, mid-ceremony, he arrived and stopped it outright. A match had been arranged back east, he announced before the gathered town, one that would restore the family's standing. Helen was placed on a stagecoach before nightfall. Daniel's last sight of her was her hand outstretched from the window, unable to reach him, her father's voice ordering the driver on. No letters ever came. None of his were ever answered. 2 years later, a rumor reached town that she had married the Eastern match after all. Daniel never confirmed it. He told himself it was mercy, not chasing a woman who'd moved on, but the truth, he admitted now, was simpler and harder. Not knowing had become easier to bear than knowing for certain he was right to grieve. Thomas sat with that for a long moment. "Have you ever tried to learn if it's true?" he asked gently. Daniel shook his head, something like shame crossing his face. 10 years, Deacon, and I never once asked." Thomas said nothing more that morning. But walking home beneath the wide, undisturbed sky, he found he could not let the question go, not to meddle, only to know, quietly, what had truly become of Helen Ashworth. He did not yet imagine how close to home that answer would turn out to be. Thomas Weller was not a man given to gossip, and he told himself more than once that week that what he was doing was not gossip either, only the quiet work of a churchman trying to understand the history of the people in his care. Still, he was careful. He asked no one directly about Helen Ashworth. He asked instead about old records, old correspondences, the kind of dry administrative trail that a judge's family might have left behind without meaning to. Mrs. Petrie proved more useful than she intended. She had kept the parish books for 30 years. And when Thomas asked with studied casualness whether the church still held any correspondence from Judge Ashworth's time in the county, she produced a tin box from the vestry, without hesitation muttering that no one had asked after it in a decade. Inside were letters, mostly dry parish business, tithes and repairs, but among them, a handful from Judge Ashworth to the previous minister, thanking him for his discretion regarding the family's arrangements and requesting more than once that no correspondence be forwarded to Helen without his review. Thomas read them twice, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. Whatever else the judge had done, he had made certain no letter reached his daughter unexamined. A visiting circuit judge, an old acquaintance of Ashworth's, gave Thomas the rest, over supper, without realizing the weight of what he was handing over. The Eastern match, he said, had collapsed within months. The nobleman had learned of the family's true financial standing and quietly withdrawn. Ashworth, humiliated twice over, had not sent Helen home. Pride would not permit it. Instead, he had placed her with a convent-run school, an orphanage 2 counties east, telling the town some vague story of a finishing arrangement. And telling Helen, this the judge said almost as an aside, not grasping its cruelty, that Daniel Hargrove had already married another woman out of impatience before she was even a year gone. Thomas set down his fork. He told her that, knowing it wasn't true. The old judge shrugged, the shrug of a man long past being troubled by other men's sins. Ashworth always did prefer a tidy story to an honest one. Thomas rode back to town that night with the weight of it pressing on him. A decade built on a lie the size of a single sentence. What he learned next came almost by accident, and it undid him more than anything before it. The orphanage where Helen had been placed, he discovered through the Mother Superior's own correspondence with the parish, had relocated 3 years prior, its original building damaged by fire, and merged its charity work with this very town's mission. the woman who now kept the altar linens fresh, who arranged the flowers before dawn each Sunday, who was gone by the time the first family arrived for service, was not merely a devoted sister of the order. She was Helen. She had taken a religious name years before, Sister Agnes, first as shelter, then, over time, as something she had come to believe was a genuine calling. She had never fully professed her final vows, some quiet, unnamed part of her unwilling, all those years, to close a door she did not remember opening. She lived less than a mile from Daniel Hargrove. She had, in a sense, been present at every Sunday service he ever attended in this town, only in the hour before he arrived, invisible to him not by design, but by the simple accident of a schedule. Thomas confirmed it through Mrs. Petrie, who, when shown a name and pressed gently, admitted she had once seen the woman's veil slip years ago and thought, briefly, of a resemblance she dismissed as fancy. "I never thought it my business to wonder further," she said, and Thomas did not blame her. He learned, too, that Sister Agnes's life at the orphanage had not been one of quiet suffering. She was, by every account, deeply loved there, patient with the children, tireless in the ledgers and linens and long hours of ordinary charity that make up most of a devoted life. Whatever grief she carried, she had built something real and good atop it. This mattered to Thomas as he considered what to do next. He did not wish to treat her years of service as a mistake to be corrected, only as a life that deserved the truth it had never been given. And there was a complication that could not wait indefinitely. Sister Agnes was scheduled, in 3 weeks' time, to take her final and permanent vows, the profession that would bind her irrevocably to the order. She had only recently decided, after years of hesitation, that this was her path, believing there was nothing left calling her back to the world she'd been taken from. Thomas sat with this for 2 days before acting. He resolved against any scheme that resembled manipulation. No arranging a chance encounter, no telling Daniel where to find her and sending him charging in unannounced, no pressuring Sister Agnes with false urgency. The only honest course, he decided, was to tell each of them the plain truth and let them choose what to do with it, beginning with Helen, since she was the one most directly lied to, and the one facing an irreversible decision. He rode to the convent and requested, respectfully, to speak with Sister Agnes about a matter concerning her past. The Mother Superior, a woman of evident warmth and long patience, studied him a moment before granting permission. "I have always sensed an unfinished question behind her eyes," she said simply. "Perhaps it's time someone asked it." Thomas found Helen, Sister Agnes, in the small garden behind the chapel, her hands still dusted with flour from the kitchens. He told her, as gently and plainly as he knew how, that Daniel Hargrove had never married, that he still came to that same altar every single Sunday and had for 10 years, waiting for no one but her. Her composure, held steady through a decade of quiet service, broke for the first time in Thomas's presence. She did not weep loudly or ask a flood of questions. She simply sat very still, her hands folded, and after a long moment asked only for time, a few days, she said to think, before her profession date arrived and the choice was no longer hers to make. Helen did not rush her answer, and Thomas did not press her for one. For 3 days she moved through her ordinary duties at the orphanage as though nothing had changed, waking the children, mending the same tears in the same donated coats, sitting with the youngest ones at supper, while they told her about a hen that had escaped the coop again. But in the hours before dawn, when the house was still quiet, she walked the paths she had walked for years, turning the truth over in her hands like a stone she was only now permitted to examine. She had built something real here. She reminded herself of that carefully, unwilling to let the last few days undo 10 years of work she believed in. The children she had raised from infancy now called her by a name she had chosen for herself. not one given to her by a father who had never once asked what she wanted. Whatever grief had brought her to this place, the life she had made from it was not a mistake. She would not let herself think of it as one, even now. But there was a difference, she found, between a life chosen because nothing else remained, and a life chosen freely, with every door still open. For 10 years she had believed the second door had closed on its own, that Daniel had walked through it without her, and left nothing behind to return to. Now she understood the door had never closed at all. Someone had simply told her it had and locked it from the outside and called the locking a mercy. She thought of her father only once briefly, without the anger she might have expected. He was 5 years in his grave. Whatever he had wanted to protect, his pride, his name, some inherited notion of what she was owed, it had cost them both a decade neither could reclaim. She did not think forgiveness was owed to a dead man's schemes. But she found she had no strength left to carry anger for someone who could no longer answer for it. On the 4th morning, she asked to see Mother Superior, and told her plainly that she needed to know the truth of her own heart before she could offer it permanently to anything else. Mother Superior, who had watched Helen's quiet, unfinished question for years without ever naming it, only nodded. "Go and find out, child," she said. "God does not need a woman who arrives at his altar still wondering what she left behind." Thomas carried word to Daniel the Saturday before, careful in how he said it. "Someone you've been waiting for may come tomorrow," he told him. "I can't say more than that, but I thought you deserved to know, rather than be caught unaware in front of the whole town." Daniel said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Thank you for that, deacon, whatever comes of it." He did not sleep well that night and did not pretend to himself that he had. Sunday came as it always did, the bell, the dust settling on the road, the widow Callahan claiming her corner by the window. Daniel took his usual seat in the second pew, the space beside him as carefully empty as it had been for 10 years, though his hands, folded in his lap, were not as still as usual. The hymn began. Light came through the tall windows and lay long across the floor. Mrs. Petrie, arranging the last of the flowers, watched the door with an expression she did not try very hard to hide. Helen entered midway through the opening hymn, not in the gray habit of the order but in a plain dress, her veil lowered, and walked the center aisle the way she had walked it once before, 10 years and 1 lifetime ago. She stopped at the same place before the altar rail where her father's voice had once ended everything. The congregation's singing faltered into a hush of turning heads, though no one moved. Daniel rose. They did not embrace at first. They stood a small distance apart, in front of the altar rail, and for a moment neither spoke, as though the years between them required its own kind of greeting before words could follow. "I was told you had married," she said finally quietly, "before I'd even been gone a year." "I was told you had," he answered, "and I never once asked to be sure." "Neither did I." They stood with that a moment, the plain, unglamorous shape of it. Not a villain's grand cruelty, only a single lie, repeated to each of them separately, left uncontested by 2 people too proud, or too afraid, to ask the question that would have unraveled it in a day. "I don't hold it against him anymore," Daniel said of the judge without being asked. "A dead man's cruelty doesn't have to keep living in us. We've given it 10 years already. That's enough." Helen's eyes were wet, though she did not weep. "I built a life there," she said. "A good one. I don't regret it." "I wouldn't ask you to," Daniel said. "I only wonder if there's room in it for this too." She looked at him a long moment, and at Mother Superior, who had come and taken a seat quietly near the back, watching with an expression of plain approval rather than concern. Helen had already decided, in the 4 days since Thomas found her in the garden, not out of rescue, not out of escape, but as a choice made with open eyes, informed by everything she had built and everything she had lost. She told him so simply. There at the rail, that she would not take her final vows in 3 weeks' time, not because the calling had been false, but because she had learned at last that she was permitted to choose between two true things, and this was the one she wanted. The wedding, when it came that autumn, was modest, no more than the town could easily hold. Ranch hands and shopkeepers, and a dozen children from the orphanage Helen still visited each week, now under Daniel's quiet patronage. Thomas led the service. And in the second pew from the front, for the first time in 10 years, the space beside Daniel was no longer empty.